to start out with a composition of mine called Electric Dreams.
If you're a guitarist who's at least gotten to the intermediate level, you've probably come across the name of Jason Becker. Jason Becker is a rare breed of being a virtuoso and a maestro, meaning at the time of his teenage years, he quickly became one of the most promising upcoming shredders of the 80s. So Jason Becker is a great example of a child prodigy, okay, because he was practicing with all of his free time at a very young age, and soon to the point where he was able to cover Yngwie's Black Star in high school for a talent show. And this allowed Jason to basically surpass everybody around him, no matter how much older they were, because he was doing nothing but practice guitar and learn music theory. He soon teamed up with Marty Friedman and formerly Cacophony, a speed metal duo with immaculate and immeasurable instrumental guitar virtuosity. This is when Jason's career began to grow, as they quickly became popular in Japan and Europe, selling out shows at a regular basis. So the duo went on releasing studio albums such as Speed Metal Symphony in 1987 and Go Off in 1989. Soon after, Marty left the duo to pursue Megadeth, and Jason began recording music for his solo career. In between the two albums, Becker released Perpetual Burn in 1988, in which was critically acclaimed as some of the best shred guitar work of the time, especially considering he was only 19 at the time. Jason then auditioned and got the gig to be David Lee Roth's lead guitarist for his solo project once he parted ways with Van Halen. It was during the recording of the album, A Little Ain't Enough in 1991, that Jason began to have health problems. The disease known as ALS took Jason's ability to walk, talk, and eventually move. However, despite doctors giving him a short life expectancy, we're blessed to still have Jason with us today, and with many albums that he's composed solely with his eyes and a computer.
Sort of one click at a time to be able to enter in the notes.
The man is nothing short of one of the most inspiring and immaculate musicians on planet Earth, and I'm going to take you through some of the most impressive works and deeply analyze his harmonic and melodic genius throughout the years. So strap yourselves in, this one's going to be a long ride. So if you start listening to Cacophony, it's going to sound very melodic, very dark, very neoclassical, of course, but this was critically acclaimed to be almost a little bit too hard for people to digest, because it was like Yngwie Malmsteen upgraded times 10, and Jason's classical influence is seen throughout pretty much both albums. Their most popular song, Speed Metal Symphony, features many neoclassical phrasing and motifs along with some very impressive shred runs. The piece begins with some very dark overtones along with sweep picking, in preparation for an F sus4 chord, which would be F, C, B flat, in which the B flat carries over into the E minor chord, creating a dark tritone feel with a nice resolution. You'll see more of that B flat or A sharp in the future. See, when you have a flat 2, it often makes us think of the Phrygian mode or a Neapolitan chord, or as they call it, an N6, in which it consists of building a major triad off of the flat 2. So in this case, in A minor, we're playing a B flat major chord. He then goes into messing around with the dominant and tonic chords, ensuring that the leading tone is raised. So we also encounter a lot of other accidentals, but Jason does a really good job of getting us back into our home key of A minor before the real fire in this composition begins. This piece resembles a lot of similarities between Vivaldi's work, specifically the Four Seasons. Measure 41 sounds a lot like Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 16 in C major. Jason does an impressive job of outlining different arpeggio shapes on the guitar, similarly to how Vivaldi did on the violin. The Immaculate G major arpeggio, along with many of the other arpeggios, resemble how violinists can slide from one arpeggio to the other. You can also make a solid comparison of this to Paganini. This would make sense because of Becker's Paganini influence. I've also noticed some Bach influence coming in this section. It can be compared to Bach's Partita in D minor No. 4. So in the song Concerto, Jason does a really good job of giving us some nice F sharp minor lines, but he is also able to go and tonicize E major because we know Jason is very good at modulation. And Jason does a really good job of using a 1-6-5 chord progression, which is a really common classical chord progression, because it gives us a very powerful motif and very powerful suspense, because it gives us that F sharp minor into the D major and then into our C7. This piece resembles a similar feel to Yngwie's Arpeggios from Hell, except Jason did more classical oriented parts, like going to the relative major, versus Yngwie, who usually sticks to a Baroque style. Jason was a modulation master in this song. Halfway through, he does a solid job of modulating to D minor by using a C-sharp diminished arpeggio. Seamlessly, he switches over into A minor, and thus exploring many keys throughout the song. You see, once you get a solid grasp on music, you can basically tonicize any key by using things like accidentals, secondary dominants, chord borrowing, and substitution. And it's a really good way to spice up your music, because typically in rock and metal, we're almost always in one key. And you can start exploring this by trying out things like relative keys and secondary dominants to start. Now going forward, we need to start looking at Jason's solo work, starting with the 1988 masterpiece, Perpetual Burn. So if you want a challenging set of songs to learn, look no further than this album, because this album is filled with crazy sweep picking runs, alternate picking, economy picking, tapping. Pretty much everything that you can possibly think of is packed into this, while also still saying really melodic and very memorable lines. The first song on the track, titled Altitudes, is a fantastic example of this. You must first watch Oz Guitar's video about the very satisfying arpeggios. He does a fantastic job analyzing the use of secondary dominants in chromatic melody, okay? Jason is a master at using non-diatonic arpeggios and making them sound natural and good in his music, because he knows which chords will sound good next to one another. This all has to do with context and how we can smoothly move from one chord to another on the fretboard. We have endless options about how to go about doing this. You see, Jason did this smooth voice leading by using chord inversions or playing arpeggios with the 3rd, 5th, or any note of the chord other than the tonic on the bottom. Things like the A6-4 chord can be heard, as the previous chord of E minor shares E as the common tone. Pianists do this all the time with their voice leading, often using inversions to make things sound more smooth, because sometimes when you simply play chords in root position only, it can sound pretty parallel and blocky, and it's not as smooth as it could be. So when you write music, you don't always have to avoid parallel motion. You know, things like parallel fifths and parallel octaves in classical music is a big no-no, because we want that smooth voice leading, but it all depends on context. The song in general honestly has some of the most beautiful B harmonic minor runs. It has some of the most beautiful harmonies with duplicating guitars. I also really like the satisfying key changing into G sharp or A flat minor. It's very satisfying. The intro and outro melodies reflect each other, in the sense that they sound like they're arguing with each other in a way, because music is a conversation, and I think Jason does a great job of doing this. It's no wonder why so many guitarists cover this one, because it's compact with some very difficult sweeps and alternate picking runs, but in my opinion, I think Jason's melodies in the song are often overlooked. He really knows how to make the instrument sing, and he knows when to repeat and alter melodies and phrasing, as well as introduce new ones. The word perpetual is defined as never-ending or changing. This is likely to a reference in the chords underneath the lead guitar constantly changing. In the song Perpetual Burn, the intro sweeps are very strange, using E minor 7 and then a D minor 9 at 11, and then an E flat major 7 flat 5. The shapes on the guitar are pretty tough, because when we start trying to sweep pick chord extensions rather than just typical triads and 7th chords, it becomes less vertical and more horizontal, so the stretching and the awkward phrasing can become a little bit more difficult. After the sequence, we can hear a nice harmonic minor melody, in which he uses a D sharp diminished chord to temporarily tonicize E major. in which you could think of this as a 7 of 5 chord. So as we've discussed, Jason is really good at modulation, or moving to another key. Now the way you do this is usually by using a pivot chord, or more specifically a pivot note, okay? And this note can sometimes be a little bit hard to identify, but usually it can be pretty obvious sometimes when we're using things like accidentals, okay? And that pivot note can really tell us that this was the moment where we shifted from one key into another. Jason used a 4 chord or a D major arpeggio to shift into F sharp minor, because F sharp is the 3rd of D major. This is almost not even noticeable because of how smooth it sounds. The last piece of this album that we will discuss in the 4th track is titled Air. Jason was never afraid to show off his fingerstyle skills and his incredible knowledge of counterpoint. After the synth intro, we're faced with some incredibly difficult finger-picking patterns that would wound up sounding extremely pleasant to our ears. This is because of his use of counter melodies in the bass, as well as his lovely treble melodies that he explores in D minor and then B minor. Jason also has a really awesome rendition of this with an orchestra playing it. I highly recommend you check it out. So if you haven't heard of Counterpoint yet, this might be the perfect song for you to kind of delve into it, because Bach was the counterpoint master back in the day, and Jason did a really good job of using counterpoint. And all counterpoint is when two voices are playing at the same time, but they're moving in different directions, okay? And when you use counterpoint versus typical harmonies, if done properly, it can sound absolutely beautiful. So this is my harmonic analysis of Air. So this is the finger picking part. And what I've noticed is that Jason, again, is very good at things like modulation. So let's take a look at the first modulation that I spotted. So I've labeled this 6 chord as in D minor, but underneath I've wrote this as a 1 chord in G minor. So this would be our pivot chord, if you were to call it, okay? And Jason does this a lot more. He also comes back to D, like over here. Jason did a lot of inversions, as we called it. So if you ever see something with a 6, that means that it's first inversion. And if you ever see something with a 6/4, like over here, that would mean that it is second inversion. So that would mean that the 5th is on the bottom. So right here, Jason was really good with using a secondary dominant chord and then going to a regular dominant chord. This is a very common thing that you can do. And the other modulation that I found was right down here. He played a 5 first inversion chord with the C sharp on the bottom in the key of D minor. But in fact, I would label that as a major 7 chord in B minor, because we eventually start getting introduced into other accidentals like this F sharp. So it can be thought of as this F sharp was our pivot note, as you'd call it. And for the rest of it, we are kind of sticking in B minor. And what Jason really likes to do is do things like counterpoint, where things are moving in different directions. Like in this section over here, it can be very evident that things are moving up here and then things are moving down, going over here. So the rest of Air features a total of 4 guitars, making very similar aspects of modulation and counterpoint, and it's a wild ride, and I'd highly recommend listening to it all the way through and following a score. Moving forward, after ALS took most of his mobility, Jason already had a good chunk of perspective done, but he still needed some of it to be completed, so he worked with some studio musicians and some audio engineers and finished the composing and the recording process. And Perspective was released in 1996. So out of all of Jason's albums, this one is definitely my personal favorite because of its clever melodic and harmonic phrasing, okay? It's a very cinematic and it's a very pretty sounding record, and I really, really like that. Versus Perpetual Burn, which is definitely very melodic, but it's a little more shreddy. And so coming from someone like me who is really into composition, I prefer this one, but both of them are fantastic. The first track, called Primal on the record, is a really nice cinematic piece that I really, really enjoy. It kind of reminds me of something that would be in like the Avatar movie or something like that. The song End of the Beginning, in my opinion, is Jason's greatest piece of music of all time, and I'll explain why. The main thing that keeps the listener interested is melody. Having memorable melodies in your music is the driving force of what makes a song work and not work. This song features some of his greatest melodies of all time. In the key of E major, we hear a lovely motif that gets echoed throughout the entire piece in a variety of different ways, making great use of an orchestra as well as a wind section. The most memorable part of the song is the sweep tapping arpeggios that make a beautiful cadence at the end of this big section. The 8th song on the album is titled Serrana. It's an insane set of melodic sweep picking in which Jason plays some really interesting chords. Now, I found a Reddit discussion of this, and it was interesting to find what some users were attempting to analyze in the key of D major, in which another user indicates that after the E minor arpeggio, things modulate to the point where D major isn't really in the picture anymore. Sometimes it's better to think of chords as borrowing from other keys, but sometimes it's very evident when modulation occurs. When labeling Roman numerals, it can kind of become a nightmare without any modulation when you start adding so many extensions, so many flatted chords. And Serrana is pretty crazy, but I'd agree that Jason may have been thinking along the lines of a hexatonic scale, like this user said, in which we use 6 pitches instead of 7 in a scale, and this can also be very effective when you're making chord progressions and arpeggios. So the user goes on to bring up the neo-riemannian theory, which was a theory developed in the 20th century by a bunch of theorists who grew up to having more dissonance and less tonicism. Because in this time period, atonality was becoming more prominent. You know, simply listening through music throughout the years, and you'll hear that music and composers just become more chromatic, more dissonant, and less use of the typical 12-key system that we're so used to. There are many more theories and formulas to this atonality, but in this case, it has more to do with making smaller movements in the voice-leading triads and not really caring about anything like keys and key signatures. Certain rules of these movements are called transformation, and if you want to know more about this theory, it's very interesting, and I'd highly recommend 12 Tones video about this. In this case, it would be the concept of going from G sharp minor to E flat major, or using the 5th of G sharp and making a major triad out of it. So it's really unclear if Jason actually meant to do this, but honestly, sometimes it is just a thing of, if it sounds good, then it just sounds good. Jason has released more works and renditions of his previous work throughout the years, and in 2018, we got Triumphant Hearts, a collaborative album featuring some incredible guitarists and composers. I especially love the string melody that kicks in before the guitar solo in the song Once Upon a Melody. It really showcases Jason's ability to orchestrate proper harmony and melody, and has some really spicy chords, especially when the lead guitar kicks in. The string melody that kicks in just before the guitar solo is very beautiful, and you can tell that this is a real live orchestra. I've noticed Jason is the master at playing in all keys. Sometimes a lot of musicians and artists that you really like usually stick to the same key, but Jason isn't really afraid to expand and go in other territories that a lot of people would be afraid of. And I like what Doug Helvering says about this fantastic orchestration.
The thing that he's done here that is so impressive is that he's got this lovely orchestral sound going, but you can hear all of these lines by the different instruments in the orchestra or by instrument groups in the orchestra very clearly. His orchestration is wonderful in that he allows space for these individual lines to be properly heard. Really, really great stuff.
There are a lot of gems on this album, such as Magic Woman, in which we get to hear Chris Broderick playing what sounds like a lute, but it could just be a really nice sounding classical guitar. And part of this section really resembles Pachelbel's Canon in D. And Uli Jon Roth also is featured on this tune, and he plays a very nice solo over some more interesting chords. So this album is kind of nothing like Jason has released before because it features so many different genres of music and exploring so many different things, but I think it's honestly right up there with Perspective, and it's right up there with Perpetual Burn. Alright gang, we did it. That's the end of the video. Wow, that was crazy. So I hope you guys took something out of this. I hope you guys can incorporate some of the stuff that we talked about and incorporate it into your own music, your own composition, your own guitar playing, all that stuff. And I learned a lot throughout this process, and I hope you did too, and I will see you guys in the next video.